Hello, Professor and fellow Speech 100 classmates. Today I'm going to talk about military contractors. I'm sure the term military contractors is not an unfamiliar term to this class, especially with all the current and former military personnel. You've heard about them on the news, work as one yourself, or work with one in your current job. From the Blackwater Security Forces to the Department of Defense overall budget reductions, military contracting has been in the news for several years and will continue for several more. Now, as a former active duty soldier, I wanted to continue to work with the military in some shape or form when I got out. You see, my father is an Army retiree with over 22 years of active duty service, so I guess you could say that the military culture was ingrained in me before I even ever enlisted. Now, when you look at our all volunteer force, what do you see? In magazines, televisions, and newspapers, you see, hear, and read about our uniformed service members. They are our fighting force. However, they are only a part of the total force structure. Part of that structure is also made up of the Department of Defense civilians and military contractors. Military contractors have been part of our American culture for hundreds of years. For example, during the Civil War, wives and those who could not fight still marched to and from one battle engagement to the next. They served as nurses, cooks, and seamstresses, just to name a few. Back then, these civilians weren't called military contractors, but essentially that's what they were. It wasn't until the Eisenhower presidency that the formal federal utilization of the term military contracting became commonplace. Now, after many years of perceived government growth, the Eisenhower administration began to examine the size of the government and determined how to curb its growth. In his inaugural address, President Eisenhower noted, quote, "The government today has 4 times the number of civilian employees it had when the Republicans were last in power, 2,591,000 as against 630,000. And its budget has been multiplied by about 20, end quote. He planned to disband a large part of this oversized government, viewing the competitive enterprise system as that primary source of national economic strength. Eisenhower saw this plan as the biggest opportunity that the business community has ever had to test the applications of its business knowledge and techniques to a more broader problem, the federal government, especially the military. In recognition of this principle, Eisenhower and his subsequent presidents relied on the general policy of using commercial suppliers of products and services the government needed and thereby reducing the size of the government and the cost of providing those products and services. What today is known as commercial services management began under the Eisenhower presidency. Now, initially, outsourcing aimed to cut government spending while also decreasing the size of the government, especially the military. Eisenhower worried that big government would make decisions that suited them best, undermining democracy. In short, they might use the pursuit of making Americans safer as a cover for all kinds of ills. Now, beginning in 1955, the Bureau of Budget issued a series of bulletins establishing the federal policy for obtaining goods and services from the private sector. Adopting the idea that government could not compete with its citizens, the Bureau stated that the federal government would not start or carry on any commercial activity that the private sector could do. Individual freedom and initiatives were seen as strengths of competitive enterprise system. The move to decrease the size of government gained renewed momentum in the 1970s, especially after the Watergate scandal. Now, during the Carter administration, many government officials advocated for the virtues of contracting. Additionally, the Reagan and first Bush administrations, in line with the traditional Republican touchstones of less government and enhanced private enterprise, codified a preference for contracting over in-house activities. Outsourcing is moving a function from performance in-house to an outside entity. The rationale for such action is that the outside entity could perform the function cheaper, if not better. Due to the negative connotation that eventually became associated with outsourcing, the concept later transformed to competitive sourcing. Today, military contractors are used throughout the world, working side by side with our military DoD civilian counterparts to make up a total force structure. There are over 100,000 troops deployed in support of overseas contingency operations, but there are just as many military contractors in support of that same mission. For example, some examples of military contractors range from IT engineers, mechanics, food services, and logistics support. They are the IT engineers that allow critical information to the combatant commanders to truck drivers driving supplies from Kuwait to Iraq. They are made up of both U.S. citizens as well as local nationals. Now, many local nationals are used throughout the world for their translation services as well as their knowledge to their host nation laws, customs, and their environments. Now, as a contractor for the past 11 years, I've had the opportunity to continue to see the world and work alongside soldiers. From deployments to Bosnia and Iraq, I've lived in Europe for 8.5 years before returning back to the States. Working as a military contractor gives me the benefits that I missed when I left the service, from traveling around the world to the overall camaraderie that the military environment brings. That's the end of my speech. Thank you.